How's it going, everyone? It is I, Anime Outlet, and this is What If Deku Could Create His Own Quirk, the movie. Sit back, relax, and enjoy, and now, let's begin. We see a 4-year-old Izuku run down the stairs of his house, running over to the living room of just his house, where we end up seeing both of his parents relaxing at the table, drinking each of their morning cups of coffee. As Izuku would stand there looking at them, all of a sudden he would start jumping up and down, just looked like he was completely shaking in excitement. "Mom, Dad," he would say with an excited look on his face. "When can we go to the Quirk doctor's office?" Izuku would say to them, as both of them would smile towards each other before looking back towards Izuku. "Calm down, Izuku. The Quirk doctor's office opens in just around an hour. Let's wait a little bit. Why don't you have some breakfast? It's over there on the table for you, and then we'll leave, okay?" Izuku would quickly nod his head before rushing over to the table, opening up his chair, or just pushing or pulling it so Izuku could hop to it, and he would end up digging in, eating so fast which would worry his mother, which would cause her to say, "Izuku, please, just slow down, okay?" She would, with a smile on her face, just sort of laughing at Izuku's manner. As Izuku would say, "Oh, okay," would say in an innocent voice before going back to eating, now this time a lot slower. So with that, we now end up seeing Izuku finish his breakfast before they would get into a car and head off to the Quirk doctor's office. As we now end up seeing Izuku sitting in the lobby as both of his parents would be talking to the receptionist. "Okay, we'll have the doctor out as soon as he can to take a look at Izuku." "Alright," she would say before both of the parents would go down, sitting on either side of Izuku. As this would be happening, the doctor would end up strolling out of the office after just about a couple of minutes, as the day was going very slowly. He would stroll out of the office before looking around for any of the patients. Talking to the receptionist, he would end up looking over towards Izuku and his parents before motioning for them to follow. "Ah, good morning, Izuku, Miss Midoriya and Mr. Midoriya. Please follow me," he would say, directing the three into a private room, where the doctor would take a couple of x-rays, some tests, just to see what there could be within Izuku. "Alright, I've deduced that young Izuku here does have a quirk. If I were to guess, it'd be a mix between your quirk and your quirk," he would say, motioning towards both Mr. Midoriya and Mrs. Midoriya. So in motion towards both of them, they would both nod, or they would reach down their hand, grabbing onto Izuku, pulling him up out of their chair, before walking over towards the car, going out of the doctor's office, getting into the parking lot, going into their car, and driving home. As Izuku would be sitting on the floor of the living room, watching just All Might cartoons and just All Might commercials for new action figures and all this and that, Izuku would be probably just jumping up in the air, saying how he wished to be like All Might so much, as All Might was just so cool. Izuku would end up also seeing another person right to the side of All Might, which happened to be the number 15 hero, Dragon's Blaze, which, unbeknownst to Izuku, happened to be his father, who had a fire-breathing quirk. As Izuku would be staring at them, he would wave his Dragon Blaze and All Might action figure in the air, just saying how they were so cool, and he couldn't wait to be just like the both of them, as his mother would end up just staring at Izuku with a smile on her face as the next day would end up arriving. As we now end up seeing Izuku walking to school before going to school, sitting down around with everyone else, as some people would just turn to Izuku. "Hey, Izuku, I heard you turned 4 yesterday." "Yeah, I did. Why? What's your quirk?" Some of them would turn after hearing the quirk conversation, with excited eyes gleefully awaiting Izuku's response. Izuku would shake his head before just smiling. I don't know yet. I just know I'm gonna have the coolest quirk ever, Izuku would say with an excited tone in his voice. Meanwhile, a young Bakugo Katsuki would walk into the room before laughing at this expression. Oh, please. We all know I already have the coolest quirk, he would say with little pops flying out of his hands, as these were just mini sparks popping and crackling within his hands, as Bakugo had some sort of explosion nitroglycerin quirk thing. It was very strange to Izuku. However, it didn't really matter too much. Izuku still really couldn't believe he was going to have a quirk very similar to his father's and his mother's. So, as Izuku would be smiling, he would end up just hearing the bell signifying the end of the school day as Izuku would be walking home. However, as Izuku would stare up at the sky, something just seemed off. The clouds weren't really sunny like they were a minute ago. It was all cloudy and dark. Izuku could just tell something just didn't seem right at all. He would hurry home before opening up the door to his house, as it was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Izuku would softly shut the door before walking into his house, where he would end up hearing sniffling and just the sounds of crying coming from his parents' bedroom. Izuku would slowly walk up the steps, making sure not to make a sound. Walking up the steps, he would peer into his parents' bedroom, where he would end up seeing Inko holding the phone up to her ear, with a tissue wadded up in her hand, just wiping the tears off of her face. Izuku would look at her, wondering what was happening, before she would end up just looking his way. However, he was gone, walking to his room, deciding he didn't like looking at his mother in such a mood. So Izuku would walk back the other way, just kind of confused, wondering what was so wrong with his mother. So we now end up seeing Izuku just in his room doing his homework before going to bed, as he would end up waking up only to see his mother downstairs, who would try to pull off a smile but still couldn't. His father was strangely absent, and Izuku didn't know why. Izuku would go over towards the TV, flicking on just TV so he could eat his pancakes while watching the just morning cartoons. However, something was interrupting them, just news. And this news would be on the hero Dragon Blaze's death. The 15th hero had died in an altercation against a mysterious villain by the name of All For One, someone who the heroes didn't have much information on. He was very mysterious to them as well. So, if Atsuku would be saddened to hear that Dragon's Blaze was no longer just alive, was his favorite hero, Izuku was quite sad by this. However, Inko would end up walking up to Izuku, putting her hand on his shoulder. Izuku, I have some news for you, she would say with a cold tone in her voice. Izuku would look up to see her stony gray eyes. It looked like she had lost all emotion in them. She would look at Izuku before speaking to him. Your father, he's dead. Izuku's eyes would widen as his entire world seemed to just be crumbling around him. His favorite hero dead, now his father dead too? It was a word the 4-year-old Izuku didn't understand much about, but he did know that if they were dead, they weren't coming back. Izuku would stare at her before hugging her leg. However, all of a sudden, smoke would end up just be fuming out of Izuku's mouth, as fire would end up coming out of his mouth as well, for Izuku would end up burping out just a fire bubble that would soon end up dissipating. Inko would quickly pull apart Izuku before grabbing onto his shoulders with just an excited look in her face. Izuku, did you just awaken your quirk? She would say, fighting back tears, excited to see the quirk she had fallen in love with all over again, now in the form of her own child. She would stare on towards Izuku with an excited face as he would end up doing it again, as he would end up jumping up into the air. Yeah, I unlocked my Quirk! Izuku would hey, as all of a sudden he would have an urge to go grab his All Might figure and just run around playing with it, as he couldn't wait to become a hero. However, he would end up looking at it oddly before reaching out his hand, as the All Might figure would come flying towards Izuku, as Izuku would end up catching it. Whoa, this is awesome! Izuku would say, as his mother would only stare towards him, hugging him even deeper. The doctor was right. Izuku had the fire breath Quirk and a stronger telekinesis Quirk, just like his parents. However, the doctor kind of was right. Izuku didn't have just both of these Quirks. He had multiple, as, well, it was really just one Quirk with a bunch packed into one. As Izuku, who, just dealing with the loss of his father, would end up just creating his own Quirk, as this Quirk would end up being a combination of all of his favorite people put into one. A fire-breathing Quirk because of his father, a telekinesis Quirk because of his mother, and a strength Quirk because of All Might. And even a water Quirk to balance out his water-breathing Quirk, or not his water-breathing, his fire just breathing Quirk to balance that out. So Izuku could balance it out with water, and because he had recently seen some water heroes on the news and thought they were cool. So, after this day, Izuku's life, although having all these cool quirks that he had created, really wasn't that good. His life had continued to go down in a downward spiral, as without the main moneymaker being his father, and Inko not having a job, being a stay-at-home mother, they would end up losing the house Izuku had grown up in from an early age, instead having to move into a very cheap apartment in just a bad side of town, causing Izuku to have to walk home, witnessing some things that just a very young child shouldn't have to witness. And Izuku would grow up having to deal with stuff like that, and by the time Izuku was 10, he would know how bad his life was. But despite this, he didn't complain, only using that as motivation, telling his mother he would get them out of this place. He would get them out of this bad neighborhood. He would save them just from just all the hardship they were dealing with by becoming a hero. And Inko never told him off about it, not because just her husband died in the line of duty, rather because she wanted Izuku to be whatever he wanted to be. Although it was going to be hard and stressful for her, she wanted Izuku to have the best life he possibly could. So Izuku would end up signing up for the UA entrance exam, as we now end up seeing Izuku walk into the UA campus, where we see Izuku walk into the auditorium, take the written exam, before going in to the hero exam hallway, where Izuku would be standing there waiting for the doors to open, as all of the students they would. Izuku would rush in using his strength quirk right into his legs, allowing for him to run in with such tremendous speed, using his eyes just running in insanely quickly. As Izuku would do this, he would end up finding a horde of robots, or he would end up just using his fire breathing out a massive cloud of flames, completely decimating the one-pointers, all lying within his path. As Izuku would continue going, breaking up some of the road with his fists, having rocks, throwing them at the robots with his telekinesis quirk. As all of a sudden, Izuku would end up here rumbling and shaking from all around him. As Izuku would hear the rattling, rumbling, and shaking, feeling that as well, he would end up looking around, seeing a massive zero-pointer towering over him, where he would end up hearing just a voice yell, "Help!" Izuku's eyes would lock in towards it, sprinting off, putting his hand out stopping the zero-pointer with his telekinesis. Izuku stares towards the zero-pointer, holding his hand out, using his telekinesis, stopping it from moving forward. With Izuku's hand strained, holding the zero-pointer tightly, as he would then crush his fingers in on each other, creating a fist, causing the zero-pointer to just form into a small, tiny ball, as all of the metal had just been crushed together so well by Izuku's powerful telekinesis, causing it to just become a tiny ball, which really just doesn't seem possible, but yet Izuku made it possible. Izuku would rush over towards where he heard the just yelling of help from. He would end up finding a black, spiky-haired girl trapped under a bunch of rocks, as Izuku would end up lifting them up with his strength quirk before lifting the girl up, bringing her over towards the recovery girl who was walking towards her. She would thank Izuku, as Izuku would just nod his head before walking off, wondering what was going to happen next, as finally, though, the just entrance exam would end up ending, where we now end up seeing Izuku walking back to his apartment, which would end up taking around an hour, as the apartments his parents lived, or his mother lived in, would end up being on a very far side of town, which would take Izuku a very long time to traverse. We see Izuku walk home, as his mother would end up greeting him at the door. "How was it, Izuku?" she would say, as Izuku would just shake his head. "It was alright, I guess. I can't really think of anything else to say." His mother would nod her head in understandment, looking at him before just saying, "Well, I'm off to go to my jobs. I wish you luck, Izuku," she would end up saying before going off. Izuku, tired from the days spent of using his quirk, would end up walking to his room before collapsing onto his bed to go to sleep. We cut forward 2 weeks to see Izuku getting a letter in the mail. Izuku would stare at the letter with the UA seal written on it, as Izuku would end up opening it, breaking the seal, as a small little metal disc would drop down. As this metal disc drops down onto Izuku's desk, he would start to play a message. "Congratulations, Izuku Midoriya. You have made Class 1B of UA High School. Congratulations for making the hero course," it would say before shutting off, self-destructing. Izuku would fall back into his chair, putting his elbow down onto the ground, wondering, Class 1B. Really? I thought I did enough to prove myself worthy of Class 1A. But I made Class 1B. I guess they really just don't have faith in me. Well, it doesn't really matter. I'm used to it after all. My entire life I've been slept on, pretty much. No one really expects much from me. Just some low, poor kid that just grew up in just the bad side of town. Such an interesting way of thinking, Izuku would tell himself, before he would end up going to bed as the next day would come, as we see Izuku put on his UA uniform, walking out of the house, as it was pitch black outside, as the school day started very early at like 7 a.m, so Izuku would have to get up at like 5:30 to start walking, as Izuku, still new to the school, would have to spend some time wandering the halls to find Class 1B. Izuku would walk all throughout the walkways and hallways before you would end up finding Class 1B. You would walk in, sitting down to see an array of just different characters. As Izuku walking in would just see everyone standing there talking to each other like they had all known each other before. Izuku, sitting down, not knowing any of them, would just stare down and would look up at the board. As all of a sudden, the teacher would end up walking in. "Good morning, Class 1B. Today we're going to be doing an exercise to see where all of you are compared to Class 1A. So we just really want to see how strong you guys are at the base level without any formal training. So, Let's begin. Go down to the locker rooms and get changed. Class 1B is a specific locker room. Just go in there, get changed, and then head out to City C. We're going to be doing some type of exercise. I'll explain it to you later. He would then break everyone off as they would all rush off to the locker rooms getting changed, as we now end up seeing Suku and just the rest of his class now standing there with the Class 1B teacher, just telling them that they are going to be doing a Heroes vs. Villains exercise. There's going to be teams of 2. One team is going to be made up of Class 1A, while the other team is going to be made up of Class 1B. So, with one team and the other, the villain team is going to have to just keep a device hidden around just a certain map for 15 minutes. Well, no, 30 minutes actually, because we're not doing it in a building like we used to. So 30 minutes in this general area, and if that 30 minutes expires or they capture both of the heroes, then that means they win. But if the heroes touch the device or knock out both of the villains, then the heroes win. Class 1A would appear out of nowhere, as they had already just had it explained to them, as they would all be walking down, just team making would begin. Izuku would be put on a team with Itsuka Kendo, while he would be up against Bakugo Katsuki and Shoto Todoroki. With them now on a team, Izuku's team would be decided that he was going to be the heroes, while Bakugo's team was going to be the villains. As they would end up be seeing just the massive red marker line that marked whether it was out of bounds or not, Izuku would end up just knowing what the boundary area was, as he would end up seeing Bakugo and Todoroki go off about to hide the device, which happened to have a tracker on it for the heroes to use. So, as those 5 minutes were up for them to hide the device, Izuku and Kendo would rush into the boundary area, as they would start to search for wherever the device had been located. Izuku would be searching around as all of a sudden a massive icicle would end up appearing out of nowhere, going right towards Izuku. Izuku would open his mouth wide, just spewing out fire, completely decimating the ice coming towards him. As Todoroki would end up jumping out of nowhere, throwing his hand out, spewing a tornado of fire, which Izuku would end up stopping by just releasing a wave of water crashing down onto Todoroki. As he would completely consume Todoroki inside this wave of water, all of a sudden Todoroki would try to use his fire again, but it wouldn't work, as since he was just completely soaked because of the water, he wasn't going to be able to use, well, his fire. So with him now lacking his fire, he would use his ice to keep Izuku at bay, who could only just use his fire breathing so much before his throat would start to burn, which luckily because of his water quirk, Izuku could use the water to cool down his throat, allowing for him to use more fire. So with Izuku doing that, chasing Todoroki, we see Kendo chasing down Bakugo Katsuki, who is leading her most likely into a trap. As she would turn a corner, Bakugo would end up appearing right at the end of the alleyway. As she would start to close in on Bakugo, all of a sudden Todoroki, who had managed to somehow lose Izuku, would appear right in front of her. As she would look around, being trapped on both sides, she would end up backing up a little bit. However, she'd be met with Todoroki right there with her, as she would end up creating her hands larger, going for a punch which Todoroki would dodge before sending out an ice wave that would just lock her in, allowing for Bakugo to be right in front of her, using an explosion to completely just consume her. Burning her chest, she would be thrown into one of the buildings, as Izuku who would end up seeing this would rush towards it. As he would end up making it, he would ask Kendo what happened, as she would only give a shaky finger off in the direction that both Todoroki and Bakugo were in. Izuku would turn his attention towards them as Bakugo would appear out of nowhere, jumping in the air with his hand held high, about to throw an explosion down onto Izuku. Izuku would get low, looking right up at Bakugo before smiling, as he would open his mouth, spewing a massive breath of fire, before he would use his telekinesis, gripping hold of the fire, allowing for just a ball of fire to be held in the air, holding Bakugo in this ball of fire, as he would be constantly spinning around, burning Bakugo at all different angles, as Bakugo would be yelling in pain, yelling for him to be let out, as Todoroki would try to sneak up on Izuku, slamming his foot on the ground as spiky ice would come out of nowhere. However, Izuku's in this would just turn his other hand that was not occupied with the telekinesis, smashing it with his strength quirk. He would turn towards Todoroki, still his hand gripped using that telekinesis, punching Todoroki right across the face, as Todoroki would be sent flying the other way into a building much like Kendo had. Finally, Kendo would end up recovering from her injuries, as she would end up getting up, rushing towards Todoroki. As Todoroki would get up out of the rubble, he would look around wondering where he had been, as he had managed to hit his head on some of the concrete after being thrown by Izuku. Kendo being there, she would use her fists, making them larger, punching Todoroki right across the face, causing him to be flying backwards once again. Todoroki, though now pretty much dry, would use his fire, burning Izuku Kendo to a crisp, as she would end up being knocked out, as Izuku would release his fire orb, as we end up seeing Bakugo Katsuki falling down to the ground, as the just burnt Bakugo would be sitting on the ground, just holding his head, just in complete pain. He'd basically just been inside of fire for forever. The only reason he wasn't getting hurt was because Izuku had to control it as to not kill Bakugo. As Bakugo falling to the ground, just pretty much injured, Izuku would walk up to him, raising his hand high. With his strength quirk, he would slam his hand down onto the side of Bakugo's neck, as Bakugo would fall limp, going unconscious. Izuku would turn his head, spewing fire out of his mouth, burning the ice that was coming towards him, as Izuku spewing so much fire would go right on towards Todoroki, burning him as well. As Izuku would end up spotting something within the rubble, it was something that had caught his eye. Izuku would rush towards it, as he would end up finding out that it happened to be the device that he was supposed to touch. As there was 5 seconds left, Izuku would rush towards it, as Todoroki would end up using his ice right into the ground, as his ice would end up catching hold of Izuku's foot, as Izuku would end up reaching towards it, but was just too far away. He would break off the ice, as it would start counting down. 3, 2, 1. Izuku would dive towards it, reaching out his hand. However, he would fall just centimeters short, as Izuku would fall down to the ground, just a finger width away from touching the device. Izuku would slam his head down onto the ground, breaking through the floor, as he would end up pulling his head out of the floor, shaking all of the dust off. He would stare on towards Todoroki, giving him just a glare, as Todoroki had stopped him from managing to win. Izuku would shrug all this off, going over, picking up the unconscious Kendo, bringing her back over towards where the Class 1B teacher was. The Class 1B teacher would look towards Izuku before patting him on the back. "Way to go, Izuku. That's what we want to see from a Class 1B member. You easily showed how you were much stronger than both the 2 of those Class 1A kids. Good job. You just got unlucky falling short of the device. Though it doesn't matter. Class 1A now knows that you're one of the best, even if you're in Class 1B. Izuku would nod his head before continuing to carry Itsuka Kendo off towards Recovery Girl's office. As we end up seeing Recovery Girl greeting Izuku, he would place her down onto the bed, as Recovery Girl would then just say, "Alright, Izuku, let's see if you have any injuries," she would say, going to check him. Izuku would get checked by Recovery Girl before thanking her after she would let him go, deeming that he was not injured at all. Izuku would leave the premises, walking back to his house, just wondering what the next day of UA was going to have in store for him. As Izuku would make it back to his house, he would go up to his room to finish up some homework before going to bed. As we cut forward a couple of weeks, as we now see Class 1A and Class 1B meeting in the auditorium of UA. "Good morning, Class 1A and B. Today we are going to be going on a field trip together. That's why we asked all of you to meet here right now." "So," Aizawa would say, "we're going to be going to a place called the Unforeseen Simulation Joint. It's basically going to be just a... how do I say this? A field trip to get you to know how to use your quirks in different scenarios. So we're going to be training in a lake, or a fire, or a city, wind blowing, a tornado, thunderstorm, all that different kinds of stuff. So we would now like you to go to the locker rooms, get changed into your hero costumes, supplied of course by the support course, and then get onto one of the designated buses for your certain class. Once you do that, we'll go to the USJ and we'll start the training." All of the students would rush off, going to their designated locker rooms, getting changed in their hero costumes before going towards wherever the bus bay was, getting onto either the Class 1A or Class 1B bus. Izuku would get onto the bus, as we now see him rushing out of the bus along with the rest of the class to marvel at how massive the USJ was. They would all look at the USJ, just looking at it with stars in their eyes. They couldn't believe just how big this place really was. So they'd all be looking at it as they'd finally walk up the steps, greeting with the supervisor of the building, 13. 13 would greet all of them before showing them inside the USJ. "This class, this is the USJ," she would say, broadening her arms, showing them, revealing the USJ in all of its glory. All of the students would give out just an sound. Look how magnificent the USJ was. They'd all walk in just completely in awe, looking around at all the different zones there was. This place was huge, many kids would mutter under their breath. We now end up seeing Izuku and the rest of his class staring on as all of a sudden a purplish portal would swirl right by the fountain of the USJ. It would start swirling rapidly before quickly expanding, opening up wider. As I saw when 13's eyes would be fixated on this. One kid would even say, "They even have fake villains here," causing Aizawa 13 to focus even more, as they would end up seeing villains seep their hands through the portal before walking fully out of the portal, as we now see massive amounts of villains standing there in front of the entire class. As Izuku would be staring at it along with Class 1A, as all of the sudden Aizawa would jump down, yelling for 13 to protect all of the classes, as King would end up doing the same, jumping down, going to fight all of the villains as well. 13 would be looking around as all of a sudden the purple villain-looking thing that had most likely supplied the villains with the portal would end up appearing out of nowhere right next to Class 1A and B. "Good morning, classes. There seems to be quite a lot of you. So, just as an added security measure to make sure our plan doesn't fail, we're gonna have to split you up a little bit. So, here goes nothing." Kirogiri would say, before opening up a portal, but under all of just Izuku with Class 1A and Class 1B, splitting them up throughout the zones, as we see Izuku falling down, landing right on his back on the just flood zone, right onto the boat. Izuku would look around before Tsuyu Asui, Mineta, and Itsuki Kendo would end up landing with him. Izuku would greet both of them, or all of them, as they would end up looking on to see Aizawa and the Mad King just taking care of all of the villains at the center, easily taking care of all the army, which would end up leaving just the villains left, or the main leader villains. These would be Shigaraki, the Nomu, and Kurogiri, of course. Izuku would look around, seeing many villains that were, of course, aquatic types, would be staring on with a murderous, hungry look written all over their face. They would be looking on towards Izuku and the other kids on the boat. However, Izuku would jump in the air, clenching his fist before punching right down into the water, causing the water to start to spiral. His water would be sent flying upwards, as all of the people would be sent flying backwards because of the massive tidal wave that Izuku had caused. This would allow for an easy entry for Izuku and the rest of people there to easily escape the boat. Once they would easily escape, Izuku would be staring on from behind a rock, watching as his teacher and Aizawa would both get mercilessly just beaten by a massive bird monster with scars littered all over his body. Izuku would be watching this very closely, as all of a sudden the bird monster would take care of easily defeating both Aizawa and his teacher. As the Nomu would end up looking around, looking for its next target, sniffing the air, wondering where everyone else was. Finally, the Nomu caught a scent, Izuku's. It would rush right on towards Izuku, smashing the rock, causing Izuku to jump back, grabbing the three of the UA students that were there with him. Pulling them back, he would set them down before running off, as the Nomu would be hot on his tail, following him ever close behind. Izuku would continue running, or he would end up turning around, using his telekinesis to stop the Nomu right in its tracks. As the Nomu would screech, just unhappy with its abilities not moving, would screech or quickly just starting to move its arms before it ended up being too strong for Izuku to do anything with it much more than just stopping it for a couple of seconds, causing it to break free of Izuku's telekinesis, rushing towards Izuku again. However, Izuku would end up jumping backwards, as he would end up breathing fire right onto Nomu, as the Nomu would screech out in pain as fire would seep out of the Nomu's just head, as the Nomu would end up jumping back, holding its head, just putting its fingers deep into its brain, just squishing it, just how much pain it was in. However, this wouldn't affect it at all, as it would easily heal from it, having a basic regeneration quirk. Izuku, seeing this, would wonder what he was supposed to do, as the Nomu would rush towards him once again, slamming a hand right into his stomach, sending him flying upwards into the ceiling, smashing through the glass roof. Izuku would fall sorry about that. Izuku would fall down from the sky, with panes of glass falling down with him, as shatters or pieces of glass would fall down as well, hitting Izuku on the face. He would wipe them off before harshly landing on his back once again, as he would choke up quite a bit. He would end up barely getting up, his back just squelching in pain, as it just kept pulsating. That's how bad it was. He would end up holding his back hunched over. However, the Nomu wouldn't even care, continuing its relentless attack, rushing towards Izuku. It would slam its fist right into Izuku's head, as Izuku would try to just stop it from hurting anymore. However, all of his efforts would be just in vain. He would feel this as if he'd just gotten hit by a truck, but he would stay where he was. He would end up using the telekinesis to divert some of the force back behind him instead of all into his head. Izuku doing this would just holding his fist before punching the Nomu right across the face, breaking some of its teeth. As the Nomu would only look towards Izuku, who, like it had done nothing, would end up slamming both its fists right into the side of Izuku's face. As Izuku would end up just feeling all of that, he would fall down to his knees, holding the side of his head with both of his hands, holding and shaking his head in pain and agony. As he would end up being punched right in the gut once again by the Nomu. Izuku would stare on towards it, wondering how was he going to be able to beat it. He would get up just one last time, remembering he couldn't die here. He still had that promise he made with his mother. He had the promise he was going to get her out of that bad neighborhood. And he couldn't just let her down now. He just couldn't. It wasn't going to be a part of his plan. So Izuku would instantly hop up, rushing towards the Nomu, using his strength quirk, and just using his telekinesis as well, to make his fists fly faster than lightning, hitting the Nomu at such rapid speed and strength that dents would start to form in the Nomu's skin. It would start screeching in pain, but Izuku was going so fast, it couldn't do anything at all. He kept punching the bird monster in front of him over and over and over again. As the Nomu would end up barely being able to jump backwards, giving off a screech before it rushed towards Izuku once again, wrapping its fingers all around each other, going to punch Izuku's stomach. However, Izuku would dodge beneath his fist, uppercutting the Nomu right in the jaw, breaking most of its teeth, before Izuku would end up looking up with smoke emitting out of his mouth. Would end up breathing a massive breath of fire going right out of it, as this fire would end up catching fire on the Nomu's brain, burning its healing part of it, as the part of the healing quirk that was stored in his brain would be completely decimated, as the Nomu would give off even more screeches, looking around now, seeing Izuku's figure. However, someone would be right there next to him, Izuku. Izuku would looking on, seeing just a blonde-haired person right next to him. You may just be in Class 1B. That doesn't mean you don't deserve to be in Class 1A. You've beaten both me and Todoroki. So how about this? I've seen how strong you are. Why don't you see how strong I am? Plus, you've probably gone through enough pain already. I'll take over things from here, Bakugo would say, as he would jump in, finishing off the already weakened Nomu, as Izuku would fall back, staring up at the sky, just breathing heavily, as having used his quirk to such an extent, and just using multiple of his quirks at the same time, it had just such an effect on Izuku's body. As Izuku would start to feel the toll it had on him, he'd be staring up at the sky, breathing heavily over and over again, before smiling, knowing that he had basically managed to defeat a stronger foe than he had ever faced before. Bakugo, taking charge, would slam an explosion right into the side of the Nomu's head, burning out one of the Nomu's eyes. The screeching Nomu end up jumping in, using its one eye, but it was at such an angle it couldn't see where Bakugo was coming from. So Bakugo would jump onto the Nomu's head, grabbing its brain, pulling the brain out of the Nomu's socket, as the Nomu would fall down to its knees, as the brain would drop to the floor. Bakugo would smile, knowing he had won, as all of a sudden, a blue-haired person would have its hand flailing out, reaching on towards Bakugo. The hand of the blue-haired man would reach out, extending towards Bakugo's face. However, before it could make contact, a person with blonde, golden-looking hair would step in before anything could happen, punching it out with his
fist hurled, it would make contact with the blue-haired man's face, sending him flying across the building. As a purple portal would open up right before the man hit one of the walls, taking him presumably back to the villain base. As we now end up seeing is Uku waking up on a hospital bed. It was Recovery Girl's hospital bed in UA. Zuko would wake up before getting up. He was extremely exhausted, but he still wanted to make it home on time. He didn't want to worry his mother at all, as she was the kind of person to worry, after all. Zuko would get out of his bed as Recovery Girl would hurry into the room. Whoa, calm down there, Zuko. You can't be leaving with your injuries. What injuries? Zuko would ask with the questioning tone within his voice. You can't tell? You clearly have injuries. It's written all over your body. Look at all the bruises, she would say, pointing out as Zuko would look over his arms and legs. They were littered with bruises from his fight with the Nomu. However, Zuko wouldn't care. It's nothing I haven't felt before. I'm tough, you know. Zuko would just giving off a look of pride. So Recovery Girl would only just give him a look, like, really? You need to go back to bed. However, Izuku wouldn't really care. She was half his size, and so Izuku really just could walk past her. She wouldn't put up much of a fight, so Izuku would just continue to walk past her, going to his house and inevitably going to bed. A month would end up passing, where Izuku would have been told that UA had just been closed off, as everyone had a month break, so UA could up security and even add in new dorm rooms, which would excite Zuko along with the rest of his class, as these dorm rooms would basically just allow for them to create friendships closer. However, before anyone would move in, there was one event that would be just making up what class they would reside in, and this event would be known as the UA Sports Festival. Zuko would look forward to it as another way to just prove himself worthy of being in Class 1A. And so when the day finally strolled around, Zuko would be staring at Class 1A as they entered out onto the field of the UA Sports Festival Coliseum. Zuko had one goal in mind, and that goal was to humiliate just the rest of what he just would think as his future classmates. As Zuko knew, if he was going to show the world that he belonged in Class 1A, he was going to show them that he was better than every single one of them in that class combined, and Zuko was going to do that in fantastic fashion. So when the first event would be announced as a race, Izuku knew this one would be easy. Over the month he had off, Izuku had been practicing on a new technique, a technique that allowed him to fly. Izuku would line up for the race, as all of this and a gunshot would be heard marking the start of it. Izuku would jump into the air, using his telekinesis on himself and being able to manipulate the air around him with his telekinesis. Izuku would allow himself to fly, and even flying at tremendous speeds. Izuku would fly at supersonic paces, just flying incredibly fast, just barely being visible to the naked eye, as Izuku would end up flying past everyone else, flying past the zero-pointer and the rest of the obstacles, and getting first place. With the first event out of the way, the second event was now in front of Izuku. This was going to be a cavalry battle, and now he had the entirety of the likes of Class 1A all staring down his throat, as Izuku knew he pretty much had just completely crushed them, even setting a new UA record in the race. And how come a Class 1B kid could do that, but not a Class 1A kid? So, with Class 1A pretty much humiliated after the first event, they would be looking for revenge. And so they would be looking to target Izuku, not only because it would have the reward of revenge, but it could also come out with the reward of just getting that fabled 1 million point headband. Izuku would know this as he would create a team full of the strongest kids themed in Class 1B, this being Itsuka Kendo, Monoma, I don't know how to pronounce his name, the copy Quirk kid, and another person. As they would end up creating this team, as Izuku, who after creating it, would end up looking on, waiting for the thing to begin. As the second event would begin, Izuku would hear just the bell sounding as everyone would look towards him with a murderous gaze, rushing towards him, all reaching their hands out, extending on for that 1 million point headband. However, Izuku's team wasn't going to let them take it that easily. Kendo would make her hands massive along with the copy Quirk kid, I don't even want to try pronouncing his name again, would slam both of their hands right into the oncoming people, causing them to be sent flying backwards. However, Bakugo Katsuki would see this, jumping over them, reaching towards Izuku. However, before he could do anything, Izuku would smile to himself, staring up at Bakugo, giving him a look that all but said that Bakugo had basically just thrown himself off of a building with that move, as he was now wide open for an attack. You can't just dodge in the air, so Izuku would look up right at him, extending his jaw away from the top of his mouth, before fire would erupt out of his mouth, completely covering Bakugo. As Bakugo would try to move himself with an explosion, a smart move, but the combination of a telekinesis quirk, Izuku would stop Bakugo from moving, causing the fire to hit with full force. As Bakugo would fall to the ground, now burned, he would walk back to his team, staring on before telling them they weren't going to be able to get the 1 million point headband, and they should rather focus on getting some smaller points. Something that shocked the team built up of mostly Class 1A kids. It really showed that Bakugo had some sort of respect towards Izuku, something that Bakugo had towards nobody else. So with that, just beating one of the top kids everyone saw as one of the strongest, Izuku wouldn't know that many kids would end up leaving, and the kids that wouldn't, he would use his telekinesis to stop them right in his path, so they really just couldn't do anything. So with that, the second event would be won, as it was now announced Izuku would be going on to play in just the UA 1v1 tournament. Izuku, having gotten first in both events, would be one of the lucky people allowed to skip forward the first event fight, rather going on towards the quarterfinals and not have to deal with the just first round. So as the kid would end up winning, Izuku would be facing off against Shoto Todoroki in the quarterfinals. Izuku would stare at him as Todoroki would do the same. As the round would begin, Todoroki would use his ice gliding towards Izuku before slamming just a massive iceberg right into Izuku's path. However, this wouldn't do anything at all. Izuku would stare at it, knowing that Todoroki should have learned from their last fight. He would use his fire breathing out of his mouth before using his telekinesis to control the fire, warping it around the iceberg until the iceberg was completely melted. And then, with all the water on the ground, Izuku would have the water rise up, creating some new water out of thin air with his water quirk, allowing him to create and control water. Izuku would rise it up into the air before slamming it down onto Todoroki, who tried to create an iceberg around himself, sort of an ice bubble. However, it would prove to be just futile, as the ice would crack under all the pressure, as Izuku would just create a box of water around it, causing so much pressure, causing the ice to end up cracking, soaking Todoroki in water, as his fire quirk would become obsolete. With his fire quirk now obsolete, Izuku would end up rushing Todoroki before swiping his legs, punching him right in the gut using his strength quirk, as Todoroki up coughing out, falling down to the ground. Izuku would pick him up by the back of his neck, twisting his hand around so he was now gripping the front of his neck before slamming him right down onto the ground. As Todoroki ended up just being flat unconscious after such a move like that. The next round would be Izuku versus Tenya Ida in the semi-finals, another kid a part of Class 1A. After beating the second strongest kid in Class 1A, no one really thought in Class 1A Ida had a chance. Nevertheless, they would still root for him, and however would be disappointed, with Ida easily being destroyed as Izuku found that Ida was clearly not as strong as Todoroki, as Izuku was just outmatching Ida by an insane margin, taking him out with a singular punch right to the side of the head. So with that, we now see Izuku in the finals of the UA Sports Festival. Izuku would end up smiling to himself, knowing that this was it. This was his chance to finally prove himself. Meanwhile, on the other side of the arena, there stood the blonde, hot-headed Bakugo. He would think to himself, this was his chance. This was it to finally get revenge on those times Izuku had just proved to Class 1A and B he was the strongest, even though he was in a lesser class. Bakugo would pace around, staring at Izuku before the round would begin, as Midnight would end up yelling, "Begin!" causing both of them to fly at each other, Bakugo using his explosions, while Izuku putting strength into his legs before kicking off, both of them flying towards each other. Bakugo would twist and contort his body to slam an explosion right into the side of Izuku, as this attack would hit just point blank. However, it wouldn't do anything at all. Izuku, meanwhile, took the time, using both of his hands, grabbing Bakugo's shoulders, slamming his head right into Bakugo's, causing Bakugo to fall right back onto his butt, holding his head. He would end up looking up at Izuku to see Izuku jumping above him. Bakugo would put his hands out, one over the other, before throwing an explosion upwards. As Izuku not having any quirks that would allow him just to move in midair, while yes, the telekinesis quirk could do so, Izuku really wasn't thinking of using it at the moment. So Izuku would fly, hitting right into the explosion that Bakugo had thrown. Izuku would be thrown backwards, landing onto the ground before getting up, now with the fury in his eyes. He couldn't let this just be some even fight. It had to be just a blowout. Izuku couldn't win or get in Class 1A if it wasn't a blowout. That's at least what Izuku's thought process was. So Izuku would rush towards Bakugo once again, now with a determination in his eyes, running right towards Bakugo, slamming a fist into Bakugo's gut before sending a massive breath of fire right to the face of Bakugo, before holding it there using his telekinesis. Izuku would then grab Bakugo with his telekinesis, slamming him down into the concrete below. Bakugo would get up from that attack, his feet wobbling underneath his body weight, as his feet were clearly in pain, along with the rest of his body. He would end up standing there, wobbling on his feet, looking on towards Izuku, standing in front of him. Bakugo would think to himself what he could do to win. Before he would take a step forward, collapsing onto his knees, he would just hold down onto some of the pebbles beneath him, holding them, gripping them in his hand, crushing them. He would drop them onto the ground in a powdery form before staring towards Izuku, jumping at him now with a new rebirth of energy before slamming a massive explosion into the side of Izuku's head. Bakugo's punch makes contact with Izuku's face, causing an explosion to send Izuku flying backwards. He catches himself right before falling out of bounds, so he would end up wobbling to his feet, trying to remain just standing on balance, as he almost fell over, just falling on his back. Suzuku, right on the edge, would end up jumping towards Bakugo, using his feet, maneuvering around him as fast as he can. Using his strength quirk, he would start bouncing around the floor before going right up to Bakugo and punching him right in the side of the face. Bakugo would then fall to his knees and then collapsed. He was so far devoid of all energy that it was just no chance that he could remain standing. He had been beaten so hard during the previous minutes of the fight that all he had left was one attack, and when that one attack was up, Bakugo was done. All it took was one punch and he was out, completely knocked out cold. The crowd would erupt into cheers as they would be watching on as Suzuki would end up smiling, knowing that he had just managed to win the UA entrance exam. He was so happy that he would end up just walking out. Izuku would walk out of the tunnel before going back to the bus bay, getting onto the Class 1B bus, not before just getting his medal and being congratulated by Class 1B. He would get onto the bus as it would then speed off on back towards the main UA school building. And once they would arrive there, Izuku would end up just sitting down in his seat. Well, good job, Izuku. It's good for you to show those Class 1A kids who's really boss around here. However, I would like to explain to you, due to your performance, you'll most likely be moved up into Class 1A. You would end up saying as Izuku would smile, just knowing that hopefully he would finally not just be looked down upon for just either his social status or anything else. He was going to be as strong as he possibly could, and that was that. So Izuku would end up walking into school the next day, only to find out he had indeed been moved up into Class 1A. Izuku would move into Class 1A, walking over towards it, opening up the door as all of Class 1A's kids would be sitting there already, staring on towards the new kid of the class. Many of them would look on kind of in confusion towards Izuku, before they would end up realizing who exactly he was. As Bakugo would end up standing up, he would walk towards Izuku, or putting out his hand. "Good job on the UA Sports Festival yesterday," he would say as Izuku would nod his head, shaking his hand back. "Yeah, you also kind of were a good opponent, I guess I could say. You're one of the strongest people I've ever faced off against, so that's at least something." Izuku would say to Bakugo as Bakugo would look towards him, or just glaring at him. "Just how about this? One of these days I'll end up beating you. Now that you're in my class after all, I'm gonna be able to train with you a lot more," would say before Aizawa would walk in yelling for everyone to sit down in their seats. Izuku would sit down. He would end up staring up towards the board, where Aizawa would end up telling them that today they were going to be picking out just who they wanted to internship for. Izuku, seeing this, would end up knowing that his dream had always been to internship or just work for All Might. Right, well, that was his second goal, of course, being a hero or work for All Might. Both of them were very high up on Izuku's job list ever since he was a young kid. So just the thought of being able to work with All Might to stop villains and as a hero, that was just an insane thought to Izuku. So with that, Izuku would be handed a bunch of papers, as he would eagerly look through all of them, hoping that he had found All Might's agency. However, even though Izuku's performance was one of the best performances in UA Sports Festival's history, he had been slept on once again. All Might's agency hadn't offered him a spot, rather offering a spot up to Todoroki and Bakugo, as every year they'd only give out 2 spots open. Of course, Todoroki and Bakugo not wanting to let the chance just run dry, they would end up taking it within a couple of seconds of even seeing All Might's agency was on their papers. While Izuku would end up finding that Endeavor had happened to find Izuku with a flame quirk and thought he could possibly train a bright new star into knowing how to use flames to their fullest potential. So with that, Izuku would choose Endeavor's agency, as we now see a bus pull up into Endeavor's Endeavor's front office, while pull up to the outside as Izuku would walk in before being greeted by Endeavor.
Hello, Izuku. I'm happy you chose my agency. Even my own son didn't want to. But that's besides the point. You see, I've seen how powerful you are, and you do have many quirks, correct?
Oh, yes, I believe I have 4? Or it's just 1 and, 4 combinations, I don't know. Zuko would say, kind of with a confused nod, as Endeavor would nod his head.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna help you on your flame-breathing quirk, alright? I feel like you have just great potential, especially if you can combine your telekinesis and your flame breathing. It would actually make for quite a powerful quirk. Izuku would look at him for a second before a light bulb would end up going off in his head. So you mean kind of manipulating my fire with my telekinesis? I've only kind of done that a little bit before into shapes to keep someone in just a still place, I guess. Yes, that's precisely what I mean. Now, there's also one other thing. It's going to be our first lesson for today, Endeavor would say, walking Izuku to just a training room. So, I want you to just breathe out some fire out, right? And now use your telekinesis, or let's just see if you can even control it without your telekinesis. Turn it into just a spear. Fire spear. Izuku would breathe out fire before trying to turn it into a spear, and just so happened, without his telekinesis quirk, he can control his fire, much like Endeavor can. Izuku's eyes would light up before he would end up spinning the fire spear around rapidly before he would end up using his telekinesis just to flick the spear as fast as he could, sending it off at hundreds of miles per hour, just blazing right through all of the walls before it would end up hitting the outside, dispersing. Izuku and Endeavor would both look through the hole that had remained because of the spear. Endeavor would look at it for a second before smiling. Good. You're already a master at that technique. Clearly, you're already on par with someone like me. Well, of course, my flames are still stronger than yours. So these next 4 days are going to be used on working your flames and just getting them stronger. And after that, I'm going to let you go out into the real world and use them, as I'm a very busy person. So I'm just going to be supervising you for around 2 hours a day before going out and doing hero work. Alright? Izuku would nod his head as their training would then begin, with Endeavor just training him different techniques and how to turn his flames into different kinds of shapes and other things, even allowing for Izuku to make sort of a fire rain, creating a fire cloud with his telekinesis and causing it just flames to drip out of this cloud of fire, which would burn anything in its path. So with that, the days would end up being over, as Izuku would walk out of his agency with his hero suit on, as he would be smiling. He'd finally get to use his techniques in the real world, and this excited Izuku. He couldn't wait, after all. It was a very exciting thing for him. So, as Izuku would be doing this, would end up stretching for a moment outside the agency before running off, looking for any villains he could possibly stop, while with one hand he would be just moving it up and down as he was sprinting, while in the other he would be staring down gladly towards his temporary hero license, which he had to take a test to earn. So with that, Izuku would hop wall for wall a building in an alleyway before getting onto a roof. However, Izuku's days, or just hours spent on the streets, really didn't award him with anything special. He didn't get anything at all, as he hadn't found anything at all either. He had been searching for something, just something that he could defeat, and he hadn't found anything. He had found no villains at all. So as he would continue searching and his night would end up passing down upon him, he would end up strolling on
on past an alleyway where an evil presence would stop him from moving. He would end up peering into the alleyway with a questionable look on his face. "What was that?" he would say. As he would peer into the alleyway, all of a sudden a red glowing eye would beam directly towards him. As all of a sudden there was a sharp object right up against his throat. Izuku would stare down onto the person that was right at his neck. As Izuku would end up smiling towards them, or he would end up breathing, as all the oxygen coming, or carbon dioxide coming out of Izuku's mouth would end up just burning up, exploding into fire, completely exploding right into the face of Stain. As Stain would end up jumping back, as his face now charred, he would drop his sword to the ground. Izuku would pick the sword up, smiling, wielding it in the air. He would breathe fire once again, before having the fire coat the sword. Izuku would rush right towards Stain, his sword just blazing as powerful as ever, before Izuku would slash down right onto Stain. As Stain's sword would end up melting, half of it melting as the blunt of the side of the blade was the only thing left, Izuku cutting cleanly through half of it after all. As Stain would look towards this, he would get out one of his daggers that he had in the side of his pants pocket. He would rush towards Izuku, going to stab him. However, Izuku's flame sword would be there once again, blocking it with ease. However, Stain would end up jumping rapidly from side to side as Izuku would continue jabbing his sword, trying to pierce Stain. However, it clearly wasn't working. While Izuku was quite skilled at using his quirks, he wasn't skilled at just being able to use a sword. He really hadn't trained in just martial arts and sword combat. He had really only trained his body in Quirk. So yes, he was physically and quirkily, gifted. He was just not so bright in the manners of sword fighting and martial arts. So one like Stain would easily be able to knock the sword out of Izuku's hand. However, this being Stain would think that Izuku only has some sort of fire quirk or explosion quirk, so if he were to just stay as far back from Izuku as possible, then he would be fine. However, that is not the case, as Izuku would end up using his telekinesis to bring Stain closer towards him. He would end up breathing out a massive air or carbon dioxide bubble that would surround Stain's face, suffocating him before it would explode off. As Stain would end up feeling this, he would still be held by Izuku's telekinesis. As all of a sudden a drop would hit the ground, a red, liquidy, just irony drop. It was a drop of Izuku's blood. As Stain would see this, he would look down towards his sword to reveal that it had cut a small bit of Izuku's just hand. And so all he had to do was lick his sword and Izuku would be paralyzed and he wouldn't be able to move at all. As Stain would try to do this, reaching down towards his sword, all of a sudden Ida would end up looking on towards Izuku. Ida, who had been paralyzed on the ground, someone Izuku didn't even know was there. "Izuku, get out of here!" He would yell. As Izuku would stare on towards his new classmate, he would look towards him with pleading eyes. "You gotta get out of here. I don't want to see you die like this. His Quirk, if he just licks any part of your blood, you'll get paralyzed." Izuku would realize his mistake before he would end up turning towards Stain after looking towards Ida. However, all of a sudden, his entire muscles would tense up, as he couldn't move a single bit. Right before Stain could lick the blood on his sword, Izuku would use his telekinesis to stop Stain from moving at all. His arm would tense up, using immense power to keep Stain at bay. He didn't want Stain to reach his sword, as if he did, that would basically mark the end of Izuku's life. So Izuku would keep that sword as far away from Stain as possible, throwing it back, as he would then rush towards Stain, punching him right across the face. Falling to the ground, Stain would reach towards the sword. However, Izuku would land on top of him, choking him out as Stain would continuously try to reach for the sword, but would continually fail, each time just being shorter from the last as Izuku would choke him out, also dragging him out of the alleyway. Finally, however, Stain would get leverage, kicking Izuku right in the gut, sending him backwards as he would make a run for the sword, which would then reveal Ida standing right there with the sword in his hand. Smiling, Ida would end up snapping the sword in half before throwing it up against the wall, as Izuku would then appear right behind Stain, punching him in the back of the head. As Stain would fall to the ground, Ida would stomp on his back. All of a sudden, however, Stain's nails would dig into Ida's skin, just digging so deep blood would start coming out of Ida's leg. Quickly, Stain would lick Ida's blood, causing Ida to be paralyzed once again. Ida would fall backwards, completely still, not able to move a single muscle. Suzuki would see this, he would end up jumping backwards, as Stain would end up smiling. Oh, as soon as you see my power working in real time, you all of a sudden jump backwards. Are you gonna be just a fake hero and run away, leaving your friend here to die? Or are you going to be a real hero and try to sacrifice your life to save someone else's? Let's see what you're gonna do, Izuku, Stain would say with a menacing voice. Suzuki would rush towards Stain, going for a punch, over dodging his own punch actually, and then using his fire breath, breathing on right to Stain, as this would burn the top of Stain's head, burning his bandana. All of a sudden, however, a fire would spark with Izuku setting it out with his fire. However, with this fire, it would catch fire to Stain's bandana, who would then throw it to Izuku, landing right on his face, blinding him as the fiery bandana would cover his eyes completely. With Izuku not able to see, he would end up tearing it off, only to reveal Stain flaunting the sword right in front of Izuku. And he would then lick the sword, paralyzing Izuku completely still. It is done, Stain would say, as all of a sudden a purplish portal would open up as a blue-haired person would step out of it. Good. Great job, Stain, he would say, walking over towards Izuku. Picking him up, he would place Quirk-canceling handcuffs around Izuku's hands, feet, and neck, dragging him over towards the portal, kicking him in. By the way, who's that kid? Oh, I don't know. I'm thinking about just letting him go. He is only a kid after all. I do tend to make dumb mistakes. But it doesn't really matter. So, what are we gonna do with Izuku there? He would say, motioning towards the portal, as Stain and Shigaraki would both walk through it. Well, I'm not sure, you would say, knocking out Izuku, or dragging him over towards a dungeon, placing him inside the dungeon. Once there, they would both consider what they were planning on doing to Izuku. He does have quite the powerful quirk after all. A strength quirk, a fire quirk, a strength quirk, a fire quirk, what else? Telekinesis, and water quirk. It's quite the insane combo. However, we just have to see if his quirk can be taken away. All for One has never failed to take away a quirk before, Shigaraki would say. That's correct, a figure would stand from behind the shadows, saying. However, I don't feel like taking this boy's quirk just yet. You see, my arsenal of quirks is a bit maxed out right now. I have a telekinesis quirk, I have a fire quirk, I have a water quirk, and I have a strength quirk. There's really no need for me to take his own quirks, as they're not going to stack upon my own. Plus, I can almost guarantee they're weaker if he couldn't have beaten Stain. My own strength quirk can beat Stain with only one punch. So, I don't suppose taking his quirk would be the right course of action. I do suppose you're right, Shigaraki would say. We cut back to UA as Endeavor would walk into UA. As he would walk in, all of them would be staring at him as he would be walking in. I've made a mistake, he would say. What is that? Nezu would say. I let Izuku go out to fight on his own for the last day of the internships, and he was kidnapped. I was able to see it from a just camera on the side of the road. He got kidnapped by that blue-haired Shigaraki kid. What? Nezu would say before he would end up canceling the rest of the internships, bringing everyone back to UA, where they would be told that dorms had been built and that they should now move in, as this would be given as a cover-up, just saying Izuku was sick, as he would then task All Might, Endeavor, and the rest of the heroes there to completely find Izuku, which was going to be a monstrous task. However, Endeavor did have one lead. Someone there had managed to luckily place a tracker on them, which happened to be Ida. Ida had a little flexibility in his wrist, and right before there he would manage to place a tiny tracker on the leg of Stain. So from that tiny tracker would be able to show their location, which happened to be the exact location Izuku was in. However, Izuku was basically useless. He couldn't use any of his quirks, and he had quirk canceling things all over his body, on his neck, on his hands, on his legs. He couldn't move his legs or wrists too much. Izuku would be sitting in a chair that would have locked him down, as he would end up reaching up his wrists, grabbing towards just the neck restraints on him. He would start finicking with one of the loose bolts on it before he would twist it out, as it would drop to the floor, making a banging sound. Izuku would then do it to another one, slowly but surely loosening up another bolt, doing it to another bolt, and then another and another, as finally it would fall down to the ground as Izuku could move his neck. Stretching it out, he would then end up moving down to his legs, untying his legs, doing the same strategy, as he would then slowly but surely stretch out his wrist to try to manage to reach some of the bolts, which luckily he could, loosening up the wrist restraints so much to the point he could take both of them off as well. With Izuku now free, he would now stand within the path of Shigaraki and a bunch of other people in the League of Villains hideout. However, before that could even happen, Shigaraki, along with All For One, would end up coming down towards the dungeon to speak with Izuku. As they would be coming down, Izuku would quickly place all of the restraints back on his body, as they end up asking Izuku some questions. Izuku wouldn't answer them, as they would walk back frustrated, having not gotten any answers out of him. Finally, however, Shigaraki, not being the one to quit, would rush back downstairs after All For One would leave to speak with Izuku, probably to torture him, as All For One was adamant about not torturing Izuku. However, Shigaraki was adamant about torturing him. And so, with All For One gone, he could torture Izuku. And so he would rush down to start his torturing. However, Izuku's restraints loosened, he would stand up as all of the restraints would fall to the floor. Shigaraki, seeing this, he would rush towards Izuku, reaching out his hand to decay part of Izuku. However, with his strength quirk, he would grab onto Shigaraki's arm, as he would end up bending it backwards. Shigaraki would yell in immense pain before falling down to the ground. As he would fall down to his knees, holding his bent wrist, he would snap it back into place, running towards Izuku. You bastard, he would say, reaching out his hands, going for it again. However, Izuku's telekinesis would completely stop Shigaraki in his path. Not so fast, Shigaraki. Izuku would staring Shigaraki in his eyes, mocking him as if. You're not gonna be able to kill me, or torture me. I'm far superior than you in strength. And since you don't have any Nomu things here, you're not gonna be able to beat me, you would say, as all of this Audenta's massive hole would be blown right through the wall, as there would reveal All Might, Endeavor, and some of the top heroes standing behind the shiny yellow #1 hero. They would all stand there before rushing in and tackling Shigaraki to the ground. As All Might would stand there, looking around, knowing that something was off. All of the sun gray portals would completely surround them as Nomus would pile out of them. Best Genius would rush over, grabbing Izuku before rushing out of there. You're lucky, kid. You're lucky you didn't get hurt during that entire ordeal. Now I'll just have to take you back to UA, he would say as Izuku would fight. No! Let me help them! Sorry, kid, but that's just too dangerous. You almost died to stay in, according to the words of Endeavor. Izuku would just be in frustration, not being able to help those heroes, as the heroes would end up fighting those Nomus, as All Might would end up having to take care of All for One, as Izuku would end up being sent back towards the UA dorms. We end up seeing All Might fighting All for One, as all the other heroes would be fighting the Nomus. All for One, knowing the heroes were coming, would have sent all of the other members of the League of Villains elsewhere, leaving just him and the Nomus to fight. As they would all be fighting, we end up seeing All Might just putting it All for One on the ropes, as some heroes had managed to defeat their crowd of Nomus and would start pushing back All for One further and further. All for One would start struggling quite a bit, not being able to just hold on to any of his strength anymore. He was quite the old man, as his immortality Quirk, while yes, was just quite the showcase and was quite the powerful Quirk, it really didn't help keep up his strength. He had the strength of an old man, and that's why he had so many different types of strength quirks. He needed a strong strength quirk to be able to even just be a fraction of a human, just a normal human in their prime. As Izuku, well, not Izuku, All for One, after aging for hundreds of years, his body had started to grow weaker. His immortality quirk didn't stop the age from growing. So with him just getting weaker and weaker, so too would his body. So too would his body, his organs, as he wouldn't be able to keep up. And also with that injury he had been blown with by All Might, then it was basically just seeing that the next fight he had with All Might would be his last. And it didn't help that all the top 10 heroes were there. And so All for One would falling down as the sheer power, All Might and the rest of the top 10 heroes would accidentally kill All for One before he would even be able to just send his power off to someone else. And with that, All for One's legacy would end. Izuku and his classmates would be huddled around a TV, all staring as All for One would end up being defeated by all these top 10 heroes. As Izuku would stare at it with a glare on his face, as he would end up just gritting his teeth and clenching his fists. I should have been there, he would mutter under his breath. Izuku would clench his fists as he was angry. He should have been there. He should have helped All Might defeat All for One. He should have helped all those heroes do it, and yet he wasn't. As that dumb Best Genius that pulled him out of air and caused him to miss just some great fighting experience. Izuku would get angry at this before just shaking his head, letting it go. You know what? It's not worth getting angry over. I'll just let this one slide for now, Izuku would say to himself before walking back up to his room. As Izuku would walk up to his room, he would lay down onto his bed before scrolling through his phone. All he could see was how all these heroes were doing just such great teamwork and this and that. It made Izuku just even more angry. He should be getting this publicity, but yet he would end up going back. this isn't why I'm a hero. I'm a hero to just help my mom. I'm a hero to save people. Zuko would say this to himself before thinking even harder. You know what? Just forget it, he would say to himself, falling to sleep. We cut forward 3 years to graduation day of UA. Zuko and everyone else had basically just gone off with no problems at all. The League of Villains were gone, and there was really nothing stopping them. They could continue on their hero journey with no villains just blocking their path from doing so. So with that, they would become heroes, getting their hero licenses and getting their diplomas from UA saying they graduated. So on graduation day, Zuko would walk up to get his diploma. Holding it up in the air, he would smile. However, all of the sudden rumbling would be heard and seen all around the campus. As many people would look around, they would wonder what was going on, as all of the sudden, out of nowhere, a massive ravine would split open the entire half of the campus, causing for UA to end up crumbling into it. As all of the sudden, spiky stairs would end up appearing as Overhaul would walk up them. He would stare towards all of the UA students, as Shigaraki would be not so far behind him. Ah, do you guys know what time it is and what day? Shigaraki would say, smiling down, looking onto a clock, or onto a watch on his phone, or on his wrist. No, why, they would say, completely just confused on what was going on, as Shigaraki would smile. It's the 2-year anniversary since All For One's death, and since you all ruined my life, he would say as Overhaul would place his hands down onto the ground. As spikes would protrude out of it, would end up going right into a couple of just general course students' stomachs, killing them instantly. As this would be happening, Izuku would jump into action, just catching both of them with his telekinesis, holding them down. It's even been so long I've forgotten all of your quirks. Thankfully, Overhaul here happened to just get defeated a couple months back, so we were able to turn him into a Nomu after just exchanging the body with a fake. It's quite the smart plan after all. And now this guy looks exactly like a human, but acts exactly like a Nomu. It was perfect. Thank God no one killed the doctor. And with the technology Ian All For One managed to create, he figured out how to inject people with quirks and take them after just sucking all of their quirk energy out of them and inject that into others. Basically, like a more human version of All For One, I guess you could say, or more mechanical and manual. But that's besides the point. You all are going to die today, Shigaraki would say, not even moving a finger, as all of the students around them would be picked up by a strong telekinesis quirk. As they would all be picked up, Zuko would land under him. As they would be picked up, Zuko would try to stop this with his telekinesis, but he was too late, all of them being sent flying into the air. Zuko, using his telekinesis, would stop everyone as he continued on falling. However, Uraraka would reach out her hand, touching Izuku, stroking just his shoulder with one tip of her finger, causing him to float into the air. As they'd all be floating there, Zuko would slowly ease them down, and so would Uraraka. With them slowly coming down, Zuko would stare towards Shigaraki, just giving him a look that said it was over. However, Shigaraki didn't budge at all, merely only smiling. Oh, please, Zuko. Like you'll be able to even land a scratch on me. That's simply not gonna work, you know. I'm not gonna lose to someone like you. Hey, I've already dealt with you before, and I'll surely be able to deal with you again. He would rush towards Izuku, however Izuku would dodge, dodged Shigaraki's attack, punching him right across the face, knocking a tooth out of Shigaraki's mouth. Shigaraki's tooth would land onto the ground, would look up towards Izuku, and Izuku would be standing over him. "I may not be able to kill you, but I will be able to knock you out," Izuku would say, knocking Shigaraki out right then and there. Shigaraki's anger had gone to his head, causing him to grow weaker, and because of this, he was emotional during his fight, making him lose his sense of self and where he was going with his just actions. So without that, he really had no course of action or plan when he was going to attack Izuku. And without that, he had nowhere else to go. He was just knocked out, done. He couldn't win without a plan, especially against just one of the top 3 heroes in all of UA. So with that, and Shigaraki knocked out, Overhaul would be captured as well, not having any orders from Shigaraki, and Izuku would continue on just the UA ceremony. With Overhaul knocked out, all of the stuff he did would end up going back into place as a side effect for some of the other quirks that he had gotten from the Quirk Doctor. With all of that said, Izuku would graduate UA and would end up becoming the #1 hero. As Izuku would become the #1 hero, he would stop all sorts of different things, just all sorts of different crimes, as his path to the #1 hero would end up causing him to just end up having a family, and his children would end up just becoming top 10 heroes as well, having just quirks similar to that of Izuku, allowing them to either just create different things or just create whatever he felt like it, create quirks and this and that. As we end up seeing Izuku smiling to himself standing over his mother's grave, an old Izuku who had long since retired his hero duties would stand over it smiling. "I did it, Mom," he would say to himself, as up just holding a letter that said his child had become the #1 hero. "My life was good. I made yours good in the final years. Now my children's life is good as well," Zuko would say to himself, smiling.
And that is where What If Deku Could Create His Own Quirk comes to an end. I hope you all did enjoy it, and if you did, please consider subscribing, as it really does help this channel out, and you can even be notified when my other series do end up coming out. I thank you all for watching once again, and goodbye.